All right, listeners, welcome back to the show. You know the drill. We pick a topic, grab some intel, and dive deep. So today, we're going deep on something a little different, but definitely relevant. Conventional arms control. Specifically, how it can play a critical role in how this whole Russo-Ukrainian war wraps up.
Yeah, that's right. We're not talking nukes this time. We're talking about the agreements that regulate the non-nuclear stuff. Tanks, planes, ships, artillery, the whole shebang. How different outcomes to this war could lead to very different types of agreements.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, the folks who maybe don't live and breathe military analysis 24/7 like we do, break it down for us. What are the main ways these agreements actually work? What tools are we talking about here?
Well, you can think of it like three basic approaches. First off, you've got those national limitations. That's like setting a cap on a country's overall military strength, so limiting how many tanks they can have, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. Then there's that whole narrow geographically focused demilitarization thing, right? Like creating buffer zones where military activity is restricted or just totally banned.
Exactly. Think DMZ's areas where you just can't have troops or weapons.
Right, right. And then, of course, there's the to the victor go the spoils approach, those discriminatory measures, where
Yeah.
basically the winner gets to dictate the terms and really kneecap the loser militarily.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The power dynamics are key here. And that brings us to the source material for this deep dive, this academic commentary we've got. It lays out some potential arms control scenarios based on different war outcomes. And let me tell you, some of the historical parallels and potential future scenarios they throw out there are pretty wild.
Well, you've definitely got my attention. But before we get too deep into the specifics, give us some groundwork. How does the actual outcome of a war influence the type of arms control agreement that's even possible? Is it really just about who wins?
Yeah, pretty much. It all boils down to leverage. The side that's perceived as the winner, they get a bigger say in restricting the other side's future military capabilities. And obviously, the more decisive the victory, the more lopsided that potential agreement can be.
So, hypothetically speaking, let's say Ukraine pulls off a clear victory. They'd be in the driver's seat when it comes to dictating terms to Russia.
Exactly. And the commentary actually explores this idea of a buffer zone, but not just any buffer zone, get this, a buffer zone that extends inside Russia itself. So imagine a chunk of Russian territory where they're completely barred from having troops or certain types of weapons.
Whoa, now that's interesting. I mean, is there any historical precedent for something like that? That sounds like a pretty hard sell for a country like Russia to give up their own territory.
It might sound crazy at first, but there are historical parallels. After World War I, you had Germany forced to accept a demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, right? And more recently, we saw a buffer zone established along the Kosovo border back in '99.
Okay, so the idea is not totally out there, but how would it actually work in practice? Are we talking like a strip of land along the border? How deep into Russian territory are we talking?
Think of it more like a security perimeter, going a significant distance into Russia. The specifics would obviously be hashed out in negotiations, but the goal would be to create space where Ukraine has early warning of any potential attack. The commentary even mentions Ukraine potentially occupying this buffer zone, kind of like how France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr in Germany after World War I.
So Russia would be forced to attack through their own territory. That's a pretty strong deterrent, you have to admit.
Exactly. It changes the whole calculus of war. And beyond just the buffer zone, Ukraine might also push for other restrictions, like limits on Russian missiles, constraints on their Black Sea fleet, maybe even preventing them from building up their military in Belarus.
Hold on. Are we talking complete disarmament here? Like what the Allies demanded of Germany after World War I? That seems like a long shot, even with a decisive Ukrainian victory.
Yeah, complete disarmament, that's probably unlikely. The scale of those historical victories was just on a different level.
Hmm.
But the point is, a Ukrainian win would give them serious leverage in shaping the future security situation.
Okay, I'm with you. Victory equals leverage at the negotiating table. But let's flip the script for a second, just for argument's sake. I say this not because I want it to happen, God forbid, but we got to be realistic. What if Russia wins this thing? What happens then? What kind of situation are we looking at?
Well, in that scenario, a pretty grim one, gotta say, Russia might very well demand the opposite, complete Ukrainian disarmament. They could potentially limit Ukraine to just a small internal security force, not even a real standing army.
Yeah.
It'd be similar to how the Allies treated the Axis powers after World War II.
Oof, yeah, talk about adding insult to injury.
Hmm.
The source material mentions these things called inter-allied military control commissions, which frankly sound pretty ominous. What are those all about?
Basically, imagine Russian officials, fresh from their victory, strutting around Kyiv, inspecting Ukrainian military facilities whenever they want. These commissions, staffed by the victors, would have a ton of authority to enforce the terms of any agreement, making damn sure Ukraine stays disarmed.
That's a pretty chilling thought, to be honest. And it ties back to something we mentioned earlier, that quote from the commentary about Russia potentially demanding a ban on foreign military forces in Ukraine, essentially trying to dictate who they can and can't partner with.
Absolutely, and that directly links back to their pre-invasion demands about NATO expansion. A Russian victory would likely embolden them to really push for those demands, basically trying to reshape the entire European security order in their favor.
So a win for Putin, that could mean a completely different game in Europe with Russia calling all the shots. But let's be honest, neither side seems poised for a knockout punch right now. What happens if this thing ends in a stalemate? What kind of agreement Frankenstein do we get then?
Well, in a stalemate scenario, the most likely outcome is some kind of demilitarized buffer zone. Think of it like a no man's land, kind of like what you see between North and South Korea, or those we see in Cyprus and Moldova.
Okay, so paint us a picture. How do these buffer zones actually work? Is it literally just a line on a map, or is there more to it?
You're talking a physical barrier, often patrolled by international peacekeeping forces. The whole point is to prevent any military activity within that zone, basically stopping the act of fighting and hopefully preventing those accidental clashes that could reignite the whole damn thing.
So basically, a big wall down the middle with some blue helmets trying to keep everyone from shooting each other. Not exactly a recipe for lasting peace, but I guess it's better than all-out war, right?
Yeah, you could say that. It's a way to hit pause on the conflict, at least for a while.
But what if they can't even agree on a buffer zone? What if all they can manage is a simple ceasefire, but without that physical separation? Is that even viable?
It's possible, sure, but that kind of ceasefire would be incredibly fragile, really shaky. Without a clear dividing line, the risk of things flaring up again is just way higher. Any little incident could spiral out of control.
Yikes. So we've got three basic scenarios here: Ukrainian victory, Russian victory, and then that messy stalemate in the middle. Each one potentially leading to a vastly different set of arms control agreements, each with their own unique set of challenges and implications.
Exactly. And those implications, well, those are what we'll be digging into in part 2 of this deep dive, folks. But until then, stay frosty out there.
Keep those helmets strapped on and those brains engaged. We'll be back soon to unpack the bigger picture implications of all this. See ya.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know, last time we were really digging into those potential arms control scenarios for the Russo-Ukrainian war, exploring all those possibilities from those buffer zones inside Russia to Ukraine potentially being completely demilitarized, some heavy stuff to think about.
No kidding. And like you always say, to figure out where you're going, you got to look back at where you've been. So let's dive into some of those historical parallels that could shed some light on what we might see going forward.
Always a good strategy. So one parallel that jumps out is the Washington Naval Treaty from way back in 1922. This was an agreement signed after World War I that put limits on the size and the number of battleships that those major powers could build.
Hold on. They were regulating warships back then. I knew those guys loved their battleships, but that's hardcore.
Oh, yeah, they understood that naval power, that was a major factor in global dominance, ruling the waves. The treaty was an attempt to prevent a crazy arms race that could lead to, well, more instability and potentially even another war.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how did it actually work? Were they out there on the docks with tape measures, making sure everyone was following the rules?
Huh. It was a bit more sophisticated than that, thankfully. But the basic idea was to set those limits on tonnage. That's the overall weight of a ship. By limiting the tonnage, they effectively limited the number and the size of the guns a ship could carry.
Ah, clever. So they were basically trying to create a level playing field, making sure that no one country could build a fleet that would just steamroll everyone else. Right.
Exactly. And you know what? It actually worked, at least for a while. The Washington Naval Treaty really helped to stabilize things internationally for about a decade.
But then, of course, things went south, as they tend to do, World War II breaking out just a couple of decades later.
Sadly, yeah. The treaty eventually broke down, partly because of those rising tensions, especially between Japan and the other countries that signed it.
Yeah.
And there were loopholes, ways to kind of get around the restrictions. You know how it goes.
So I guess the lesson here is that even with a treaty, things could still fall apart if the overall political climate gets bad enough.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway. Arms control is only as good as the political will behind it, the commitment of the countries involved. But that doesn't mean those agreements are pointless. Not at all. They can buy time, create some breathing room for diplomacy to maybe work its magic.
Right, right. Even if those agreements don't last forever, maybe they can at least stop things from going completely off the rails.
Yeah.
So what other historical examples are out there? Anything else we can learn from?
Well, another interesting one, and this one's a bit more controversial, is the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935.
Ah, yeah, the one where Britain basically gave Hitler the green light to build up his navy, right?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. The agreement did allow Germany to expand its naval forces, but it still capped them at a percentage of British naval strength. They weren't just given free rein.
But didn't that end up being a huge mistake? Giving Hitler a pass to build up his military? It seems so obvious now, but what were they thinking back then?
It's easy to judge with hindsight, but the world was a very different place back then. The trauma of World War I was still fresh in everyone's minds, and there was this overwhelming desire to avoid another war at any cost. A lot of people in Britain, they really believed that by making some concessions, they could appease Hitler, keep him happy and prevent another conflict.
Appeasement. Well, we all know how that turned out.
Yeah, not so well. In the end, the agreement obviously failed to prevent World War II, and it's often used as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of trying to appease dictators.
Right, right. So we've got two very different historical examples here. One that promoted some stability, at least for a little while, and another that backfired spectacularly.
Exactly, and both of them offer valuable lessons for today for how we approach these things. The Washington Naval Treaty shows that arms control can work, but it takes real commitment from all the parties involved. And the Anglo-German Agreement, well, that one reminds us that there's a fine line between making concessions to keep the peace and actually emboldening those aggressive actors, those who might want to take advantage of a perceived weakness.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And all of this ties directly back to what's happening in Ukraine today. So let's bring it back to the present. We've talked about those buffer zones, the possibility of disarmament, even dug into some of the historical precedents. But what about the elephant in the room, NATO? How does all of this impact the future of the alliance?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And like most things with this conflict, the answer is complicated. It really depends on how this war ultimately ends. So let's start with the worst-case scenario for the West. A Russian victory.
Okay, so Putin's standing in Kyiv, victorious. What does that mean for NATO? What happens to the alliance?
Well, a Russian victory would almost certainly embolden them to push even harder for a security architecture that favors them. Think back to those pre-war demands about limiting NATO expansion and their influence in Eastern Europe. They'd be coming to the negotiating table in a very strong position.
Right, they'd have all the momentum. What kind of specific demands might they make?
It could be anything from limits on NATO troop deployments in Eastern Europe to restrictions on military exercises near their borders. They might even try to revive that pre-war demand for a hard guarantee that Ukraine never joins NATO. They'd want to push NATO back from their borders.
So basically, they'd want to roll back NATO's presence and create their own buffer zone between Russia and the West, kind of the opposite of that buffer zone inside Russia that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And coming off a victory, they might just have the leverage to make those demands stick.
Not a pretty picture for NATO. But let's say the opposite happens. Let's say Ukraine wins. How would that impact the alliance?
Well, in that scenario, you could see a more assertive NATO, emboldened by Russia's setback, and looking to really project strength and send a clear message of deterrence. They'd want to show that they're not backing down.
So instead of shrinking, NATO might actually expand its presence.
It's definitely possible. We could see more troop deployments, more frequent and larger-scale military exercises, and maybe even an accelerated timeline for Ukraine's membership in NATO. It would be a pretty significant shift in the balance of power.
Wow. Talk about a complete reversal, from appeasement to confrontation. But what about that messy middle ground, that stalemate? What happens to NATO then?
A stalemate would probably be the most challenging scenario for NATO to navigate. On one hand, they'd be relieved that Russia didn't achieve a clear-cut victory.
Right, no victory parade for Putin in Kyiv, but...
But a stalemate leaves all those core issues unresolved, right? And it creates a long-term security headache for NATO. They'd be in a tough spot.
So they'd be stuck in this holding pattern, constantly dealing with a simmering conflict that could reignite at any moment.
Exactly, and they'd have to walk a tightrope, trying to deter further Russian aggression while also avoiding any kind of direct confrontation that could escalate things into a larger conflict. It'd be a real diplomatic and military challenge.
Sounds like a lot of sleepless nights for those NATO folks in Brussels.
You can bet on that. It would require some serious diplomacy, a lot of military preparedness, and a very clear-eyed understanding of what's at stake.
Well, so far we've covered a lot of ground, from the nitty-gritty details of arms control agreements to the potential impact on NATO And it's clear that the stakes are incredibly high, no matter how this war ultimately ends.
We've explored those historical parallels, analyzed those potential future scenarios, and I think it really underscores just how complex and interconnected all these factors are.
And while we don't have a crystal ball, hopefully this deep dive is giving you a good framework for thinking about those possibilities, the challenges, and the potential consequences of this conflict, no matter how it plays out.
Because in the end, this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's going to have ripple effects globally for years to come.
And those global ripple effects, well, that's exactly what we're going to be tackling in the final part of our deep dive. All right, listeners, welcome back to the deep dive. We spent the last 2 episodes really digging into all the potential arms control scenarios that could come out of this Russo-Ukrainian war, haven't we? We talked buffer zones, disarmament, even dug up some historical parallels, like that whole Anglo-German naval agreement mess.
Yeah, always a good reminder that even when you're trying to do the right thing, things can still go very, very wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're kind of shifting gears, moving beyond the actual battlefield and looking at the potential long-term consequences of this whole thing, the things that are going to shape not just the security landscape, but also societies, economies, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. Because no matter how this ends, whether it's a decisive victory, a crushing defeat, or some kind of messy stalemate, the ripple effects, they're going to be felt for years, probably decades to come.
So where do we even begin to unpack all of that? It's a lot to consider.
Well, one area where we're already seeing some massive changes is the economic landscape, right? All those sanctions on Russia, the disruptions to the global supply chains, the whole energy crisis, it's all having a huge impact on economies around the world.
Yeah, and it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet either, right? This is about real people, their lives, their ability to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads, to heat their homes.
You got it that. This is about people, and the economic fallout of this war, it's hitting ordinary people hard, both in those countries directly involved and in those far beyond the conflict zone.
So we're talking rising inflation, job losses, maybe even a global recession.
Yeah, I mean, all of those are definitely possibilities, and the longer this war drags on, the more painful it's all going to be.
Okay, so the economic picture is, well, it's pretty bleak.
Oh.
What about the political fallout? How is this war reshaping the global balance of power? I mean, are alliances changing? Are things shifting?
We're definitely seeing a significant realignment, yeah. The West has largely united behind Ukraine, providing all that military and economic support.
Right, right. We've got NATO sending weapons, the EU imposing sanctions. It's a pretty solid front against Russia, at least on the surface.
Yeah, on the surface. But it's also important to remember that not everyone is totally on board with this, this Western-led response to the war.
You're talking about countries like China and India, right? They've been pretty hesitant to condemn Russia's actions.
Exactly. They have their own interests, their own priorities, and they're not necessarily willing to just blindly follow the West's lead.
So are we seeing a kind of splintering of the international system?
Yeah.
Like different blocks emerging, each with its own agenda, maybe even competing with each other.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And that kind of fragmentation, that could have major implications for global governance, trade, and even security down the line.
Okay, so the political map is being redrawn, economies are in turmoil. What about the human cost of all this? I mean, we're talking about thousands of lives lost, millions of people displaced from their homes, and countless others traumatized by the violence.
It's a tragedy. There's no other way to put it. And the scars of this war, those are going to run deep for generations to come.
Yeah, you're right. We're talking about physical trauma, psychological trauma, families torn apart, communities shattered.
Exactly. And the long-term consequences of that kind of trauma, well, those are almost impossible to fully grasp, to really understand what it'll mean. It could lead to increased social unrest, political instability, maybe even more violence down the road.
So this war, it's not just about land or resources. It's about, it's about the very soul of a nation, the well-being of its people, their future.
You said it. And the impact on Ukrainian society, it's going to be profound, and it's going to be long-lasting.
So we got economic turmoil, political realignment, and a truly devastating human toll.
Mm.
Is there any light at the end of this tunnel? Any reason for optimism amidst all this?
Well, even with all the darkness, there are some glimmers of hope, some things to be encouraged about. We're seeing incredible resilience and determination from the Ukrainian people.
Right. Yeah, their willingness to fight for their country, for their freedom. It's incredibly inspiring to see, for sure.
It is. And we're also seeing a renewed focus on international cooperation, on solidarity, at least among those countries supporting Ukraine.
So maybe, just maybe, This war could actually be a catalyst for positive change, a wake-up call for the world to come together and finally address some of those root causes of these conflicts.
It's a long shot, I'll admit, but it's not impossible. And even when faced with these huge challenges, it's important to hold on to that hope to keep striving for a better future.
Couldn't said it better myself. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Russo-Ukrainian War and its potential long-term consequences. It's been a heavy journey, I'll admit, filled with some really tough questions and even tougher answers.
We've explored the military aspects, the political side, the economic fallout, and the human cost of this conflict. And while we can't predict the future, hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of what's at stake, what we're all facing.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about all of us. It's a reminder of how fragile peace really is, how interconnected our world is, and how desperately we need to find a path toward a more just and sustainable future.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, we encourage you to keep learning, keep engaging with these issues, keep asking those tough questions, because the more informed we all are, the better equipped we'll be to face whatever challenges lie ahead.
Well said. That's what the deep dive is all about, folks. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next one.